I know they can't be here with us today, but if Todd and Julie could share a message with the world, what do you think they'd want them to know?
I think they'd want folks to know that they are the same people they've always been, that they didn't do these things, and that they're going to fight to get their name cleared.
Your clients, Todd and Julie Chrisley, they surrendered to begin serving their prison sentences. I'm curious about their mental states. How are they doing?
Todd and Julie are both very faithful people. They're very, very strong, and I think they've taken that strength, that inner strength and that faith with them to prison. It's a tough time for any family facing something like this, but they know what the road ahead looks like, and they know they have an opportunity to appeal their case. That's what they're doing, and they're optimistic about those results.
So I believe there was a change. Julie originally was going to serve her time in Florida, but she's since shifted to a Lexington, Kentucky facility. Why the change?
That's a question for the Bureau of Prisons. Folks get designated by the Department of Justice, the subset, the Bureau of Prisons, and that's up to them ultimately. It may have to do with space. It may have to do with issues at the facility in Florida, but it's nothing that we can tell you.
What are Todd and Julie's biggest concerns about this journey that lies ahead?
I think the biggest concern that we've been discussing recently is making sure that the world knows sort of how they ended up in this place, that the caricature of them as these sort of greedy villains that the government's tried to paint is just not accurate. And I think making sure the world knows a broader picture and a broader story as to what led to this case, how this case proceeded, and ultimately what put them in prison.
We've been listening to the various Chrisley podcasts leading up into this day, and there were a lot of comments that were made where they were even seemingly up until the last minute optimistic for a miracle.
There is that possibility of my husband and I being separated, but there's a difference between my husband and I being separated for a period of time and having to say goodbye forever.
Yeah. If there is a miracle that happens, then guess what? You're going to come on the next week.
I think they're optimistic, and let me be clear, I think that optimism is well placed. This trial was riddled with errors, and we expect the appeals court to see that.
Have they been able to be in touch with their family? Are they able to rely on each other during such a trying time?
I think that the family has plans for how they're going to communicate, and I expect they'll follow through on those plans. The federal prisons, each one has a different visitation schedule. You are allowed to visit with family. And again, this is a close family, and they're obviously going to spend time visiting with one another.
Their 10-year-old Chloe, we hold her so near and dear to our hearts. Do you know how she's doing and if she'll be able to participate in some of these visitations?
Chloe's 10 years old, and I know that she's on TV at certain times, but outside of that, I think it's probably best that Chloe be allowed to grow up as any other 10-year-old would. One day they're watching cartoons, one day they're upset about the meal. I don't know, how Chloe feels about her lunch today, but, being a 10-year-old is hard no matter what the circumstances are.
Let me ask you a little bit about restitution. We understand that they owe $17 million in restitution. How do they plan to bounce back from that?
Well, again, that's presuming that restitution is going to be upheld. We think it's likely not to be.
Why is that?
Oh, because the way the court calculated it was incorrect. There's a number of issues, as I said, in this case that are likely to be reversed on appeal.
Did they start putting any sort of a plan into motion before they started serving their sentence about, repaying that restitution?
The main focus and the main plan right now is to make sure that the errors of the trial court are reversed by the appeals court.
Going in day one, is the fight to get out already started?
Absolutely. I think that anybody who's facing a prison term and is in a contested case with the government is going to try to fight, well before they end up behind those bars, and will continue to fight when they are.
Are the Chrisleys exhausted? They've been fighting for a long time.
I think it's one of these things, exhaustion or non-exhaustion. The life you have is what you're facing. It's sort of like if you have cancer. Cancer is a difficult, long thing to move through. So is a criminal prosecution. That's an analogy that I often use to describe this to folks who aren't lawyers. Even if you have cancer, it's a difficult thing to face, but your judge, your doctor may tell you you've got a good prognosis. Here, I think ultimately they do have a good prognosis to be able to get out of prison, but they have to take it a step at a time.
We've been listening to these Chrisley podcasts, like I mentioned before, and they've been very adamant that they don't have faith in the judicial system. Now, to hear that they do have faith in the system, that they're optimistic that an appeal could be the end result. Talk to me about that shift in mentality.
Well, it's the difference between saying what happened to us is wrong, and I don't have faith that it shouldn't have happened in the first place, and then having some faith that ultimately the truth of what happened to you will be revealed as the process continues. But there are different players at each step in a criminal prosecution. You've got the prosecutors who bring a case, you've got the jury and the judge who tries a case, and then you've got an appeals court that's purpose is to review what that prior court has done. Those are different people, and you can believe that you are sort of harmed at the lower levels and be hopeful that that will stop when you move on along the appeal.
What is the strongest tenet of the appeal that makes you guys confident that this all could be reversed?
I think there's two things. I think the very beginning of this case was an unconstitutional search by the Georgia Department of Revenue. This court's already found that was unconstitutional, and it should have stopped the whole case in its tracks. That didn't happen, and that's certainly one of the things we're pursuing on appeal. The second piece is one of the IRS officers who testified about whether the Chrisleys had paid certain taxes. That certainly, we think, affected the jury, and we believe it'll be a basis for a new trial.
We've heard Todd talk about making a documentary.
We're at a much better place, with new show content that's going to be coming out, that's going to be giving you a whole new perspective of the Chrisley family. The documentary that we're working on right now is going to be very telling.
What do you know about this documentary and the message that the Chrisley family wants to now show the world?
Yeah, I don't have any details about the documentary. I can just tell you that there is a story there about what they've been through the past year or two that hasn't been told.
You think there is a story there? I mean, what do you think could be in a documentary that might ultimately vindicate them?
Well, look, again, as I said before, this case started because an officer with the Georgia Department of Revenue went into the Chrisleys' property without a warrant, pretended to have a warrant, and seized all their stuff. That sort of government overreach and government misconduct started on day one, has continued throughout the prosecution.
We have the kids on our hearts, the adult children and the minor children. What kind of strain has this put on the family, and ultimately, how are they going to prevail through this all?
Look, any family who faces a loved one going to prison, it's a very difficult challenge. That's true for this family, but they're strong, they're faithful, and I think they'll continue in that way forward.